There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a story you already know by heart, a stillness that only comes when the battles have ended and the details begin to breathe. Dragon Ball Z ran for 291 episodes across nearly a decade of Japanese television, and buried within every frame of that long, unhurried journey were facts so small and so steady that most viewers passed right over them. Tonight, we slow down enough to notice them, so find a comfortable position, let the room grow soft around you, and subscribe if these gentle stories are something you'd like to carry with you. Then let's begin. Moving quietly through the many ordinary wonders that made Dragon Ball Z what it was, beginning with the world that existed long before a single episode ever aired. Dragon Ball Z did not arrive fully formed from nothing. It grew slowly and carefully out of what had come before it, inheriting both a massive audience and a creative team that was, in many ways, still learning how to translate the energy of Akira Toriyama's manga pages into something that could live on a television screen. The original Dragon Ball series had already run for 153 episodes by the time production began on its successor. That earlier series laid the foundation for nearly every technical and storytelling choice that would follow. The animators, the voice cast, the composers, the background artists, most of them had already spent years together inside that shared creative world. Akira Toriyama had been writing and drawing the Dragon Ball manga in Weekly Shonen Jump since the 19th of November, 1984. By the time Dragon Ball Z debuted on Fuji TV on the 26th of April, 1989, the manga was already well into its next major story arc. That gap between the manga's page and the television screen would define much of Dragon Ball Z's production rhythm for years to come. The anime team was always chasing the manga, always trying to measure the distance between what Toriyama had written and what they had already broadcast. It was a careful, ongoing negotiation that shaped the entire series in ways that most viewers never consciously noticed. The very first episode of Dragon Ball Z was titled The Arrival of Raditz. It aired on that April morning in 1989, and it introduced Raditz, Goku's older brother, to an audience that had spent years watching Goku as an essentially solitary figure, unconnected to any larger cosmic family. That single revelation, that Goku was not human and not alone, changed the emotional architecture of everything that followed. The production team understood that they were beginning something very different from what Dragon Ball had been, and so they moved carefully, building the new world one quiet episode at a time. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Toei Animation, the studio responsible for producing Dragon Ball Z, operated on a weekly broadcast schedule throughout the entire run of the series. This meant that a new episode needed to be completed and delivered every single week without interruption, for nearly a decade of continuous production. The scale of that undertaking was enormous and largely invisible to viewers at home. Behind every episode were teams of key animators, in-between animators, background painters, ink and paint workers, and editors all working in coordinated sequence to meet a deadline that never moved. The production process for a single episode of Dragon Ball Z typically began several weeks before its air date. Scripts were written and approved, then passed to storyboard artists who translated the written scenes into visual sequences, panel by panel, much like a rough graphic novel. Those storyboards were then handed to layout artists who established precise camera angles and character positioning for every shot. Only after that foundational work was complete did the key animation stage begin, in which the most important frames of movement were drawn by the studio's most experienced animators. In between animation, the process of drawing the frames that exist between the key poses to create the illusion of smooth movement was often handled by teams of junior animators or outsourced to partner studios. This practice, known in the Japanese animation industry as sakuga when done at exceptional quality, meant that the visual polish of any given scene could vary noticeably from one moment to the next. Experienced viewers of Dragon Ball Z eventually learned to recognize certain animators by the particular way they drew a hand or shaped a burst of energy. Those personal signatures were always there, quiet and consistent, just beneath the surface of the story. The background art department worked largely in parallel with the animation teams. Background painters created the environments, the rocky landscapes of Planet Makak, the gray stone walls of the hyperbolic time chamber, the green rolling hills of the area around Goku's house, using gouache paint on paper, producing physical artworks that were then photographed and composited with the animation cells. Each background piece represented hours of careful, methodical work by artists whose names rarely appeared in any form of public recognition. Their paintings gave the world of Dragon Ball Z its particular sense of texture and depth, grounding the story's more extraordinary events in places that felt, somehow, quietly real. Dragon Ball Z is divided, in most official and fan-recognized structures, into several major story arcs. The Saiyan Saga covers the first 35 episodes, introducing the threat of the Saiyans and concluding with Goku's arrival on the battlefield and his battle with Vegeta. The Namek and Captain Ginyu Saga follows, spanning episodes 36 through 74, carrying the story across the galaxy to a distant planet and a villain who seemed, at first, to be the final answer to every question the series had asked. The Frieza Saga then unfolds across episodes 75 through 107, stretching across weeks of broadcast time and eventually producing one of the most discussed narrative sequences in the history of television animation. The Garlic Jr. Saga, which runs from episode 108 through 117, holds a distinctive place in Dragon Ball Z history. It is entirely composed of filler material, original content produced by the anime's writing team, rather than adapted from Toriyama's manga. The Garlic Jr. character had appeared previously in the first Dragon Ball Z movie, Dead Zone, but his presence in the television series was an invention of the production team, inserted during a period when the manga had not yet provided enough material to continue the story. Garlic Jr. himself was a compact and somewhat unusual villain, motivated by a desire for immortality and driven by a personal grudge against Kami. The Cell Saga, which begins around episode 140 and extends through episode 194, is one of the longest and most structurally complex arcs in the series. It introduced Android 17, Android 18, Android 16, and the creature known as Cell, each of whom arrived with their own detailed backstory and their own particular relationship to the scientist Dr. Gero and his long, patient plan for revenge against Goku. The arc also introduced the concept of the hyperbolic time chamber in a much more central way than ever before, using that impossible space as the primary training ground for the saga's central transformation sequence. The Majin Buu saga, which occupies the final portion of the series from roughly episode 195 through episode 291, is the longest single arc in Dragon Ball Z. It introduced a new generation of fighters, brought back characters who had been absent for many years of story time, and ultimately ended the series with a fight that took place not in a single dramatic location, but across the whole of Earth itself. The production team was aware during this period that the series was approaching its conclusion, and there is a particular quality to the pacing of those final episodes, something slightly more reflective, slightly more willing to pause and breathe, that distinguishes them from the faster rhythms of earlier arcs. Filler episodes are a subject that invites much more thoughtful examination than they typically receive. In the context of Dragon Ball Z, filler refers to any episode or portion of an episode that did not directly adapt content from Akira Toriyama's manga. These episodes were produced out of necessity. The anime was moving through the manga's story at a pace that sometimes brought the broadcast dangerously close to the point where the source material had not yet been written. Rather than interrupt the weekly schedule or repeat previously aired episodes, the production team created original content to fill the gap. The total number of filler episodes in Dragon Ball Z is a matter of some variation depending on how filler is defined. If one counts only episodes that contain no manga-adapted content whatsoever, the number is generally estimated at around 100 episodes out of the total 291. If partial filler, episodes that mix original and adapted content, is included in the count, the figure rises considerably. Either way, a meaningful portion of Dragon Ball Z's total runtime was created entirely by the anime's writers, independent of the original manga. Some of these filler sequences are quite short, a few minutes of original content inserted into an otherwise adapted episode to slow the pace and buy additional time. Others are full, multi-episode arcs. The Garlic Jr. saga mentioned earlier is one example. Another notable extended filler sequence occurs during the Cell Saga, when Goku and Gohan emerge from the hyperbolic time chamber, and the story pauses to follow several other characters through a series of loosely connected adventures, while the main plot holds its position. These sequences tend to be gentler in tone than the saga arcs that surround them, less concerned with escalating power levels, and more interested in the texture of daily life in the Dragon Ball world. One of the most gently unusual filler episodes in the entire series is episode 125, in which Gohan, still adjusting to life back on Earth, following the events on Namek, attends school for the first time. The episode is quiet and almost entirely free of combat. It observes the awkwardness of a child who has grown up largely outside ordinary social structures, now trying to navigate a classroom, a lunch period, a group of peers who know nothing of aliens or battles or transformations. There is something unexpectedly tender about it, a brief pause in the larger story to ask what it might actually feel like to be Gohan, which is a question the series rarely had the time or inclination to ask. Akira Toriyama was born on the 5th of April 1955 in Nagoya, Japan. He showed an interest in drawing from a young age and eventually attended a vocational school before finding work at an advertising company, where he spent time creating commercial illustrations. His entry into manga was somewhat accidental. He submitted a short work to Weekly Shonen Jump in the late 1970s, primarily out of curiosity, and was surprised when the editorial team responded with encouragement. His early works, particularly Dr. Slump, established him as a creator with a distinctive visual sense and a particular gift for combining physical comedy with warm, unhurried character work. Dragon Ball began as a loose adaptation of the classic Chinese novel Journey to the West, transplanting the mythological pilgrimage of Sun Wukong into a world of martial arts tournaments and magical wish-granting orbs. Toriyama has said in various interviews that he did not initially plan the series to last as long as it did. The story evolved in response to reader feedback, editorial suggestions, and Toriyama's own growing interest in the characters he was developing. By the time the story reached its later arcs, it had traveled very far from those early lighter chapters, but it retained, in Toriyama's line work and in the rhythm of his storytelling, the same essential warmth. Toriyama drew Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, which are a single continuous manga divided into two titles primarily for publication and commercial reasons, every week for approximately 11 years, from 1984 to 1995. Working under the demanding rhythm of weekly serialization in one of Japan's highest circulation manga magazines meant that Toriyama was rarely more than a few weeks ahead of his publication deadline. He has described his creative process during this period as improvisational in several places. He often made decisions about plot and character in the moment, discovering where the story wanted to go as he was drawing it rather than following a predetermined outline. The Dragon Ball manga ran for 519 chapters in total, collected into 42 tankobon volumes. These volumes were released with the distinctive deep red spines that became immediately recognizable to readers in Japan and, eventually, around the world. Each volume collected approximately 12 to 15 chapters, and the covers were painted by Toriyama himself in a full-color style that showcased his abilities as a visual artist in a different register than his black and white interior pages. Those cover paintings, with their clean lines and bright palette, gave the volumes a particular feeling of completeness, like artifacts from a world that had been thought through all the way to its edges. Masako Nozawa has voiced Goku in the Japanese version of Dragon Ball Z since the very beginning of the franchise, since, in fact, the original Dragon Ball series that preceded it. She was born in January of 1936, and she first took the role of the young Son Goku when the original Dragon Ball anime began in 1986. The fact that a single performer has voiced the same character from childhood through adulthood across multiple series, movies, and decades of production is genuinely unusual in the history of animation. Nozawa has said in interviews that she approaches the role with a physical commitment that goes beyond simply reading lines. She considers the character's internal state with each recording session, trying to understand what Goku is feeling, rather than simply what he is saying. Ryo Horikawa voiced Vegeta in the Japanese version of Dragon Ball Z, bringing a particular formality and controlled intensity to the character that became inseparable from how audiences understood him. Vegeta is a character whose emotional range is narrower than Goku's in some respects, and much wider in others. He is proud, controlled, and frequently dismissive, but beneath those surfaces lies a complicated and sometimes deeply wounded person. Horikawa has spoken about the challenge of voicing a character who must be simultaneously threatening and sympathetic, arrogant, and secretly yearning for something he can barely name. The performance he gave across the course of the series is one of the quiet achievements of Dragon Ball Z's production. The English dub of Dragon Ball Z, produced by FU Animation Entertainment beginning in the mid-1990s, had a complicated and somewhat unusual early history. The first attempt at an English-language dub was produced in partnership between Funimation and a Canadian company called the Ocean Group, which provided the voice cast for the first 67 episodes. This version of the dub featured voices that many longtime viewers remember with great affection, blue-eyed memories of after-school viewing in living rooms that no longer exist. When Funimation eventually continued production independently, they recast most of the roles with their own in-house cast in FT. Worth, Texas, creating a vocal texture that was noticeably different from the Ocean Group version and that would define the series for most of its North American audience. Sean Schemmel, who voiced Goku in the Fumation dub, has become as associated with the character in English as Masako Nozawa is in Japanese. Schemmel has spoken publicly about the physical demands of the role, particularly in scenes requiring extreme vocal exertion. During the recording of the first Super Saiyan transformation sequence, he reportedly pushed his performance so hard that he briefly lost consciousness in the recording booth, an anecdote that has become one of the most widely repeated stories in Dragon Ball Z dubbing history. Whether the details of the story have been refined through years of retelling, the essential fact it conveys is real. The performance required something genuine from the people giving it. Christopher Sabat, who voiced both Vegeta and Piccolo in the FU Animation dub, approached those two characters as fundamentally different vocal challenges. Vegeta required a specific kind of cold authority, a voice that conveyed status and controlled contempt without ever becoming cartoonish. Piccolo required something more resonant and grounded, a voice that communicated patience and a kind of earned wisdom. That Sabat voiced both characters across the entire run of the series, maintaining their distinctness and their internal consistency, is a demonstration of the discipline that professional voice acting demands when it is practiced at its most careful. The original Japanese score for Dragon Ball Z was composed by Shunsuke Kikuchi, who had also composed the music for the original Dragon Ball series. Kikuchi was a prolific composer for Toei Animation across several decades, working on a wide range of productions in addition to the Dragon Ball franchise. His compositional approach for Dragon Ball Z was rooted in a particular kind of orchestral urgency, short, looping cues built around memorable melodic phrases designed to be felt as much as heard. The main theme, Chala Head Chala, performed by vocalist Hironobu Kagawa, became one of the most recognizable pieces of music associated with the series and remains deeply connected to the emotional memory of the franchise for Japanese audiences. The ending theme of Dragon Ball Z during the Saiyan and Namek sagas was a song called Detekoi Tobikiri Zenkai Power, which translated roughly as "Come Out, Incredible Full Power." It was a considerably more playful piece of music than the dramatic opening theme, lighter in tone and distinctly upbeat. The contrast between the opening and ending themes created a particular emotional bracket around each episode. The opening announced the weight of what was coming, and the ending quietly released it. This kind of deliberate tonal framing through music is something the production team clearly thought carefully about, even if the viewers absorbing it on a weekly basis rarely paused to notice the structure. The North American broadcast of Dragon Ball Z, beginning in 1996, used a completely different musical score produced by a composer named Bruce Faulconer. Faulconer's approach was dramatically different from Kikuchi's. His music was heavier, more electronic in texture, built around synthesized orchestral sounds and driving rhythmic energy. The Faulconer score gave the North American version of Dragon Ball Z a particularly intense, almost cinematic quality that distinguished it from both the Japanese original and from most other animated series airing in American television at the time. For the generation of viewers who encountered Dragon Ball Z through that broadcast, Faulconer's compositions are as emotionally inseparable from the series as Kikuchi's are for Japanese audiences. Faulconer produced a substantial body of work for the series, composing hundreds of individual cues across several years of production. He and his team created specific pieces for nearly every major recurring character and situation: a brooding, low theme for Vegeta, a weightier and more ominous texture for Cell, a particular quality of sonic urgency for moments of transformation. This level of musical specificity helped create the impression that Dragon Ball Z was operating on an unusually high production level compared to the standard of dubbed anime available to North American audiences during that period. The music was doing a significant portion of the emotional work in each scene, and it was doing it with considerable care. The concept of measurable power levels, expressed as numerical values on a device called a scouter, was introduced early in Dragon Ball Z as a narrative tool for communicating the relative strength of characters to the audience. A scouter was a piece of technology used by members of Frieza's forces, worn over one eye like a monocle, and it could detect and display the energy output of any nearby living being. When Raditz arrived on Earth, his scouter read Goku's power level at 416, which was presented as considerably higher than a normal human but modest relative to what Raditz himself possessed. These early numbers gave the story a specific, almost administrative quality, as though the universe operated according to a precisely maintained hierarchy that could be measured and recorded. The Daisen Shu guidebooks, official reference volumes released by Shueisha and Toei Animation, contain a range of canonical power level figures for characters at various points in the story. These guidebooks were carefully produced compendiums of series data, including character profiles, attack descriptions, timeline information, and power level charts. They are among the most comprehensive official sources for Dragon Ball Z facts and are treated as reliable reference material by dedicated fans and researchers. The power level figures they contain are not always complete. Many characters and many story moments were never officially assigned a numerical value, but what exists represents the most authoritative available record of how the series creators understood the relative hierarchy of strength within the story. Goku's power level at the start of Dragon Ball Z, as recorded in official sources, is listed at 416 without any enhancement and at 912 with the use of the Kaioken technique multiplier at its lowest setting. King Vegeta, the ruler of the Saiyans and Vegeta's father, had a power level recorded in the Daisen Shu at approximately 10,000. Frieza, at his full power, the form he achieves in his climactic battle with Goku on Namek, was given a power level of 120 million in official sources. That number, enormous as it was eventually surpassed by subsequent villains in the story. But at the moment it was introduced, it served as a kind of architectural statement, a way of communicating to the audience just how enormous the distance was between where the story had been and where it had now arrived. The Scouter, as a narrative device, was eventually abandoned by the story itself, in a way that was both practical and philosophically interesting. As the characters trained and grew stronger, their power levels became too large and too volatile for Scouters to track reliably. Vegeta's Scouter explodes when he tries to measure Goku's power during the Saiyan Saga, and this moment is treated as something genuinely significant: the instruments of the old order failing to contain the new reality. From that point forward, the story measured strength not through numbers, but through context and consequence, through the size of the craters left behind and the way the sky responded to a transformation. The shift was quiet but complete. The hyperbolic time chamber, known in the original Japanese as the Room of Spirit and Time, is one of the most conceptually unusual locations in Dragon Ball Z. It exists inside Kami's Lookout, the structure floating high above Earth that serves as the residence of Earth's guardian. The chamber is accessible through a single door, and once entered, it presents an environment that is almost entirely featureless, vast, white, and undifferentiated, stretching in every direction without visible limit. The ground is solid, the sky is bright, and the atmosphere is breathable, but the scale of the space communicates something beyond simply size. It communicates emptiness, specifically and deliberately, as a condition designed to force the person inside to turn entirely inward. Time passes differently inside the hyperbolic time chamber. 1 year inside the chamber corresponds to approximately 1 day in the outside world. This means that a person entering the chamber could spend what would feel to them like a full year of practice, meditation, and physical development, while only a single day passed for everyone who waited outside. The chamber's interior was also designed with specific environmental challenges. Gravity was described as approximately 10 times greater than Earth's surface gravity, and the temperature varied between extremes of cold and heat, depending on the region within the space. These physical challenges meant that simple survival inside the chamber required a baseline of physical conditioning that most humans could not have met. The rules governing use of the hyperbolic time chamber are specific and worth examining carefully. According to official Dragon Ball Z materials, only 2 people can enter the chamber at any given time. A single person can spend the maximum of 2 years inside the chamber across the course of their entire lifetime, the equivalent of approximately 2 days of outside time. But 2 years of subjective experience. Attempting to spend more time than the allowed maximum risks permanent loss of the ability to exit the chamber, leaving the occupant trapped in that vast, silent whiteness with no way back to the world outside. This limitation was not merely a narrative convenience, it gave the chamber a genuine and consequential weight. Goku and Gohan were the first characters to enter the hyperbolic time chamber during the Cell Saga, emerging after their year of training with transformations that neither had previously achieved. Vegeta and future Trunks had entered before them, and their year of training had produced its own results. The idea of characters spending years of subjective time training while the outside story held its position was narratively elegant. It allowed for significant internal development to occur off-screen, appearing to the audience as a sudden and dramatic change, while feeling, from the character's perspective, like the product of long and difficult work. The chamber externalized what is usually invisible in stories about growth and change. Gohan spent his year inside the chamber alongside his father, and the nature of their relationship during that time is something the series touches on with particular care. Goku had been absent, by one means or another, for much of Gohan's childhood. The chamber gave them uninterrupted time together in a space where there was nothing else to attend to. No other characters, no ongoing crises, no interruptions. The training they shared during those episodes has a quieter emotional texture than much of what surrounds it, something more like a father and son finally having the time and the silence to understand each other. Senzu beans are small, ordinary-looking seeds that, when eaten, restore the consumer to full physical health. Wounds close, exhaustion dissolves, broken bones knit back together, and the person who was moments before on the edge of death stands up whole and calm. They are grown by Korin, a white-furred, somewhat sardonic anthropomorphic cat who lives atop a tower of extraordinary height, known as Korin Tower. Goku first visited Korin and the tower in the original Dragon Ball series as part of his training, and the relationship between Goku and Korin carried over into Dragon Ball Z as a quiet background element, a small thread of continuity between the two series. The production rate of Senzu beans is consistently presented as slow and difficult to predict. Korin grows them with care, and the yield from any given season might be only a small handful. This scarcity gives the beans a strategic weight in the story that they would not have if they could simply be produced in unlimited quantities. Characters discuss the Senzu bean supply as a resource to be managed, a finite number of recoveries that must be allocated thoughtfully across the challenges they face. This kind of resource management is unusual in Dragon Ball Z, which is generally more interested in power and transformation than in logistics. The Senzu bean's scarcity is one of the few places where the story acknowledges that the world has limits. Yajirobe, a somewhat rotund and self-interested swordsman who had appeared in the original Dragon Ball series, became the primary courier for Senzu beans during Dragon Ball Z. He was not a strong fighter by the standards of the series. His power level was well below that of any of the main fighters, but he was reliable, mobile enough to reach most locations, and apparently trusted with this quiet, important responsibility. The image of Yajirobe arriving at a battle's aftermath, producing a small bag of beans with his characteristic unhurried manner, became a recurring feature of the series. He rarely participated in the fights directly, but he influenced their outcomes in a persistent and understated way. The Senzu bean scenes in Dragon Ball Z are often among the quietest in their respective episodes. After the shouting and the energy and the landscape-altering collisions of battle, someone produces a bean, someone else eats it, and the wounds disappear. There is almost always a moment of stillness in these sequences, a brief pause that allows both the characters and the audience to absorb the transition from crisis to recovery. Those quiet seconds, small as they are, represent something essential about the pacing of Dragon Ball Z at its best, the willingness to let a moment of restoration breathe before the next challenge begins. Namekians are one of the most thoroughly developed non-human species in Dragon Ball Z, and examining them closely reveals a great deal of careful thought in their original design. They are tall, green-skinned beings with antennae and pointed ears, capable of extraordinary physical feats and possessing a connection to a form of spiritual energy that ordinary humans lack. The Namekian homeworld, planet Namek, was originally a peaceful agricultural world before it was discovered and targeted by Frieza's forces. The planet's natural state, lush, green, with small crystalline structures scattered across an otherwise quiet landscape, is described in considerable detail during the Namek Saga, giving the audience a sense of a place with its own history and its own particular texture. Namekian biology contains several facts that the series presents with a calm matter-of-factness. Namekians are biologically male. They do not reproduce through conventional means. Instead, they reproduce through a form of cellular regeneration, producing new Namekians through a process that requires no partner. They do not eat solid food. This dietary simplicity is connected in the story to the Namekians' general orientation toward restraint and self-sufficiency. They do not accumulate possessions in the way that human cultures tend to. They do not build cities in the conventional sense. Their communities are small, their structures modest, and their relationship to the physical world is governed by a philosophy of careful and non-excessive use. Namekians also possess the ability to regenerate lost body parts, provided a sufficient amount of their body remains intact. This regenerative capacity is central to Piccolo's character. Throughout Dragon Ball Z, he loses limbs and restores them multiple times in the course of the series, and the casual ease with which he does so communicates something specific about how he relates to physical harm. It does not frighten him in the way it might frighten a human character. It is simply something that happens, and then something that is repaired. This bodily equanimity gives Piccolo a particular calm in battle that is distinct from the more emotionally charged performances of Goku or Vegeta. The Dragon Balls of planet Namek are described as significantly more powerful than the Dragon Balls of Earth. The Earth's Dragon Balls, created by Kami, could grant any 3 wishes within a defined set of limitations. They could not, for example, bring back more than 1 person per use, and they could not restore someone who had died of natural causes. The Namekian Dragon Balls, created by the Grand Elder Guru and housed across the planet's surface in the care of 7 village elders, were each much larger than their Earth counterparts, the size of a volleyball compared to the Earth Dragon Ball's somewhat smaller dimensions. and could grant free wishes with fewer of the same limitations. They could, most significantly, bring back multiple people who had been killed in a single act. The Grand Elder Guru was the patriarch of all Namekians alive during the events of the Namek Saga. He was ancient, enormous, and visibly in decline throughout the story. His life had been slowly shortened by grief following the destruction of most of his people by a great storm many years before the story begins. Guru possessed the ability to unlock the hidden potential within any individual he chose to focus his concentration on, releasing capabilities that the individual carried but could not independently access. He used this ability on Krillin and Gohan during the Namek Saga, elevating both of them to power levels they would not otherwise have reached for a much longer period of time. This quiet act, an old being offering a gift it took a lifetime to accumulate, is one of the more understated moments of grace in Dragon Ball Z's long story. The Saiyans are presented in Dragon Ball Z as a warrior race that existed in a specific and largely tragic historical context. Their home planet, known variously in official sources as Planet Vegeta or Vegeta Se, was a world of powerful gravity and harsh terrain that produced, over generations, beings of exceptional physical capability. The Saiyans were a conquering people. Their economy and social structure were built around the acquisition and resale of planets, a practice that required them to be simultaneously capable fighters and mobile operators. They worked for much of their known history under the authority of Frieza's interplanetary empire, serving as the primary force used to clear planets of their existing populations before those planets were sold to new inhabitants. Saiyan biology includes several features that the series describes with considerable specificity. Saiyans do not age visibly after reaching their physical prime, which falls somewhere in what would correspond to a person's late 20s or early 30s in human terms. This means that a Saiyan of 50 years, 100 years, or even more might appear indistinguishable from one of 25. This arrested aging does not confer immortality. Saiyans can be killed, and presumably they do eventually die, but it means that the relationship between appearance and experience is fundamentally different for them than it is for humans. Goku's apparent youth throughout Dragon Ball Z, even as his son grows from a young child to a teenager, is a quiet expression of this biological fact. The Saiyan transformation known as the Great Ape form, triggered by exposure to a full moon or to an artificial version of lunar energy called a Blutz wave, is presented as a fundamental biological feature of the species rather than an acquired ability. Every Saiyan with a tail is capable of this transformation. The form dramatically amplifies the Saiyan's size and physical power, but at the cost of rational cognition. Most Saiyans in Great Ape form operate on instinct and aggression rather than thought. The only known exception to this cognitive loss is a controlled state called the Golden Great Ape form, which appears in Dragon Ball GT and represents an almost unprecedented combination of the form's physical power with the retention of conscious awareness. The Saiyan tail is a physiological feature that carries considerable narrative significance. In infancy, a Saiyan's tail represents a vulnerability. Grabbing and squeezing it causes immediate physical weakness and pain, a quality that is used as a plot device at several points in the early series. As a Saiyan matures and trains, this vulnerability can be overcome through conditioning, to the point where the tail becomes simply a physical appendage without weakness. Goku's tail was removed and then regrew multiple times during the original Dragon Ball series, and it was ultimately removed permanently by Kami early in Dragon Ball Z, eliminating the risk of accidental Great Ape transformation. The destruction of Planet Vegeta is one of the foundational events of Dragon Ball Z's backstory, and examining the details of how that destruction is presented reveals something interesting about the story's relationship to history. Frieza ordered the planet's destruction out of fear of the ancient Saiyan legend of the Super Saiyan, a being of extraordinary power said to appear once every 1,000 years, and fear of the growing combined strength of the Saiyan race under his employ. The destruction was carried out swiftly and quietly, presented to the rest of Frieza's forces as the result of a meteor impact. Very few people, even within Frieza's organization, knew the truth. Vegeta knew and carried that knowledge for years. a knowledge of betrayal and complicity that lay beneath his pride and his fury and his complicated, slow transformation across the course of the series. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The Super Saiyan transformation is perhaps the most discussed moment in Dragon Ball Z's entire run, and approaching it slowly and factually reveals a set of details that are often overlooked in the excitement of the transformation itself. The first Super Saiyan transformation in the series occurs in episode 95, titled Transformed at Last, Son Goku, the legendary Super Saiyan. Goku achieves the transformation on planet Namek during his battle with Frieza, following the death of his friend Krillin. The transformation was not, in Toriyama's account of its origins, planned from the beginning of the series. It emerged from a combination of narrative need and a specific practical consideration. Toriyama has said in interviews that one of the reasons he created the Super Saiyan transformation was to reduce his own workload. Drawing Goku's dark, spiky hair required meticulous attention to detail and significant ink work at the small scale of a manga panel. A character with golden, straight hair would require considerably less detailed line work to produce convincingly. The Super Saiyan form's iconic appearance, golden hair, teal eyes, slightly increased musculature, golden aura, was thus partly a product of an artist's practical problem-solving rather than purely narrative inspiration. This origin does not diminish the transformation's impact in any way. It simply adds a quiet layer of human and creative reality to one of animation's most memorable moments. The Super Saiyan transformation in the anime is accompanied by a sequence of visual and atmospheric effects that took the animation team considerable care to produce. The golden aura that surrounds the transformed Saiyan is not simply colored light. It has a specific flickering, almost electrical quality that suggests contained energy pushing against its own boundaries. The sky in the background of the Namek transformation scene shifts to a deep orange, and the landscape around Goku responds physically to the energy being released. The camera work in these sequences, moving from close details to wide establishing shots and back, creates a visual rhythm that matches the emotional escalation in the music. These choices were made by the episode's director and animation team, and their care is evident in every frame. The subsequent Super Saiyan transformations in Dragon Ball Z, the forms achieved by Vegeta, Future Trunks, Gohan, and others, each have their own specific circumstances and their own particular emotional context. Future Trunks achieves the form in a tragic and solitary future in response to a loss that has defined his entire life. Vegeta achieves it not through a moment of grief or sacrifice, but through sheer force of will, through training that was, by his own description, punishment applied to the body until the body yielded to the demand. Gohan achieves a form beyond Super Saiyan during the Cell Saga that the other characters do not reach, a transformation that is presented as emerging from a specific quality of Gohan's nature, rather than from the standard Saiyan pathway of pain, anger, and resolve. The Super Saiyan 2 form, which Gohan achieves during his battle with Cell in episode 184, is distinguished from the standard Super Saiyan form by a visible crackling electrical discharge within the aura, slightly more erect and defined hair, and a qualitatively different quality of presence. The animators chose to represent the difference through these specific visual cues rather than simply increasing the brightness or size of the existing Super Saiyan effects. The electrical discharge in particular became closely associated with Gohan's version of the transformation, a small visual detail that gave the form a signature that was distinctly his own and that audiences recognized and responded to long after the episode had aired. Dragon Ball Z produced 13 theatrical films during the series' original run, beginning with Dead Zone in 1989 and concluding with Wrath of the Dragon in 1995. These films were released primarily to coincide with the Toei Animation Film Festival, a twice-yearly event during which several Toei productions would release theatrical features simultaneously as a package for young audiences. The festival format meant that Dragon Ball Z films were often quite short, most run between approximately 40 minutes and 1 hour, and were produced on schedules that overlapped with the ongoing production of the television series. The result was a set of films that exist in a complicated canonical relationship with the main series, featuring characters and situations that don't precisely fit within the timeline of the television episodes. The first film, Dead Zone, features a villain named Garlic Jr., who was briefly discussed earlier as the basis for the Garlic Jr. Saga filler arc in the television series. In the film, Garlic Jr. achieves his goal of immortality through the Dragon Balls before ultimately being trapped in a dimensional void of his own creation, the dead zone of the title. This film is sometimes cited as the most straightforward in terms of narrative continuity, as it appears to take place before the main events of Dragon Ball Z and does not require significant adjustment to place within the overall timeline. It is a modest and compact film, more interested in atmosphere and choreography than in the character work that defines the television series at its best. The World's Strongest, the second film, features a villain named Dr. Wheelo, a scientist whose brain has been preserved in a mechanical body inside a laboratory frozen beneath the ice. It is a film with a notably different visual palette from most of the series. The icy mountain setting and the laboratory interior give it a colder, more static quality than the outdoor landscapes of the television series. The film introduces a form of bio-warriors, genetically engineered fighters, that would be revisited in more elaborate form with the Cell character in the television series several years later. Whether this thematic connection was deliberate is not confirmed in any official source, but it is a detail worth noting. The Tree of Might, the third theatrical film, is perhaps the most narratively ambitious of the early Dragon Ball Z features. It introduces a character named Turles, a Saiyan who resembles Goku closely enough to create confusion and whose motivations involve a cosmic tree that consumes the life energy of an entire planet to produce a single fruit of extraordinary power. The film is notable for presenting a version of the Saiyan warrior philosophy, the belief that strength justifies everything, that the universe is properly organized around the logic of the powerful consuming the weak. In its most direct and unambiguous form, Turles is, in many respects, what Goku might have become had his early childhood taken a different shape. The film does not belabor this observation, but it is present in every scene they share. Lord Slug is the fourth theatrical film, and it introduces a great Namekian villain of the same name. A particularly powerful Namekian who has become deeply corrupted and whose age and power have made him something between a warlord and a natural disaster. The film's most interesting detail may be the brief sequence in which Gohan, facing an apparently hopeless situation, begins to hum a melody he remembers from his early childhood, a simple tune that triggers a sudden and temporary increase in his power. The music he hums is the opening theme of the original Dragon Ball series. Whether this was intended as an in-world detail or as a self-referential gesture by the filmmakers is open to interpretation. Either way, it is a small and affecting moment in a film that otherwise moves quickly and efficiently through its plot. The fifth film, Cooler's Revenge, introduced Frieza's older brother Cooler, who arrives on Earth seeking revenge after learning that Goku, the Saiyan who killed his brother, has settled there. Cooler has a fifth transformation form that Frieza, by his own choice, never developed, and this additional evolution gives the film its central dramatic escalation. Cooler returned in the sixth film, Return of Cooler, in a mechanical, cybernetically enhanced form that represented a different approach to the concept of evolving beyond one's natural limits. The two Cooler films are generally considered among the most tightly constructed of the Dragon Ball Z theatrical features, with a clarity of antagonist motivation and a directness of narrative structure that makes them easy to follow and emotionally consistent throughout. Super Android 13 introduces a trio of previously unknown android models, androids 13, 14, and 15, created by Dr. Gero's research before his own android creations destroyed him in the television series. This film presents an interesting hypothetical. What would the products of Dr. Gero's research look like if they had been completed under different circumstances? The answer the film proposes is a set of large, powerful, and somewhat methodical fighters whose design aesthetic is distinct from the androids seen in the television series. Android 13, in particular, undergoes a transformation sequence that draws from the data of the destroyed 14 and 15, a mechanical version of the power-through absorption concept that Cell would explore in a much more elaborate way. BoJack Unbound was released in 1993 and features a group of villains who had been imprisoned within a star by the four Kaio until Goku's death during the Cell arc released the seal that held them. It is notable for being one of the few Dragon Ball Z theatrical films in which Goku does not play a central role. His death in the television series means that he is largely absent from this film, appearing briefly in a moment of encouragement before the climax. The film belongs primarily to Gohan, and the resolution of its central conflict relies on Gohan achieving the same emotional state that triggered his Super Saiyan 2 transformation in the television series. It is a film that works best when understood as a continuation of Gohan's character arc, rather than a standalone adventure. The World Martial Arts Tournament is one of the oldest narrative institutions in the Dragon Ball franchise, predating Dragon Ball Z by the entire length of the original series. It is a public competition held every 3 years, open to fighters from around the world, in which contestants compete through a combination of preliminary rounds and a final tournament bracket. The tournament takes place at a specific venue, the World Tournament Arena, which is located on a small island accessible by ferry. The setting has a consistent visual identity across its appearances in the series. A wide stone platform as the primary ring, wooden bleachers for spectators, a commentator's booth, and the general atmosphere of a public sporting event with food vendors and a festival quality that stands in quiet contrast to the world-ending stakes of the sagas that surround it. The rules of the World Martial Arts Tournament are specific and worth understanding carefully. Victory is achieved by either knocking the opponent out of the ring, rendering the opponent unconscious for a count of 10, or forcing the opponent to concede defeat. Death is not a permitted method of victory. A fighter who kills their opponent is disqualified. The ring itself is a large stone platform elevated above the ground, and the area outside the ring is clearly delineated. These precise, institutional rules create a particular kind of tension in Dragon Ball Z tournament sequences, because the audience knows that many of the fighters participating are capable of far more destructive acts than the tournament format allows. The rules constrain the characters into a smaller space of possibility, and watching them navigate that constraint produces its own kind of drama. The first tournament appearance in Dragon Ball Z occurs during the Great Saiyan Saga and the World Tournament Saga, which together form the opening of the Majin Buu arc. Gohan, now a teenager, enters the tournament along with Goku, who has returned from the dead for a single day, and several other familiar characters. The tournament serves here as a structural and tonal pivot point, a return to the lighter, more playful energy of the original Dragon Ball series before the story descends into the serious conflicts of the Majin Buu arc. These episodes have a quality of nostalgic pleasure that is distinct from anything else in Dragon Ball Z's run. A brief visit to the world as it was before the Saiyans arrived, or something that at least resembles it. The junior division of the World Martial Arts Tournament, introduced during this same arc, features young Trunks and young Goten competing against children their own age. Given that both Trunks and Goten are already capable of Super Saiyan transformation and possess power levels that would dwarf any adult professional fighter, the junior division has a gentle absurdity to it. The other children are simply not in the same category as these two, and the tournament sequences involving them have a quality of restrained comedy. Two extraordinarily powerful children playing in a context that was clearly not designed with beings like them in mind. Trunks wins the junior division through the simple expedient of knowing what he is capable of, while Goten is disqualified for inadvertently transforming. The rules of the tournament, applied to characters for whom those rules were never remotely intended, produce their own quietly amusing results. Future Trunks occupies a unique structural position in Dragon Ball Z. He is a character from an alternate future timeline, a version of the Dragon Ball Z world in which the events of the main story did not unfold the way they did in the primary narrative. In his timeline, Goku died of a viral heart disease before the arrival of the androids. Vegeta, Piccolo, and most of the other Z fighters were killed by androids 17 and 18, who in that timeline operated with a casual, almost playful destructiveness, treating their attacks on human populations as entertainment rather than strategic action. Gohan survived and spent years as future Trunks' only teacher and protector, before eventually being killed himself. Future Trunks is, by the time the audience meets him, the last survivor of a version of this world's defensive force. Future Trunks travels back in time using a time machine created by his mother Bulma, and his arrival in the main timeline produces one of Dragon Ball Z's most carefully constructed narrative sequences. He appears, defeats Frieza and his father King Cold in a matter of minutes, and then waits for Goku to arrive. The casual efficiency with which he dispatches Frieza and Cold, characters who had been the series' defining threats for multiple arcs, communicates something precise about the scale of what the upcoming story will require. The audience is being shown, in a concentrated way, how much the power level of the series has escalated since the Frieza arc, without yet being told any of the details that explain how or why. The heart virus that future Trunks travels back in time to prevent is a specific and somewhat clinical detail in an otherwise large-scale story. Goku, in future Trunks' timeline, died of a viral heart condition that was simply not treatable with the technology available. Future Trunks brings with him the antidote medication that had been developed later, and this medication is given to Goku before the virus can claim him in the main timeline. The act of carrying this medication, small, practical, biochemical, across time and between realities is, in its own quiet way, one of the most tender actions in the entire series. It is future Trunks preserving the life that his own timeline could not preserve, offering his past a possibility that his present never had. The visual design of future Trunks was created with several specific details that distinguish him from his younger, alternate timeline counterpart. He wears a biker jacket, boots, and carries a sword, a weapon that is notable in the Dragon Ball world, where hand-to-hand combat and energy attacks are the standard forms of fighting. The sword is not the primary source of his power, but it is a part of his visual identity, connecting him to a kind of earth-bound, practical combat ethic that reflects the world he came from. A world where survival required more than energy blasts, where having a physical weapon meant something when the energy ran out. He is a character marked by his history in visible, immediate ways, and the animation team understood how to communicate that history through design. Capsule Corporation is the most technologically advanced private organization in the Dragon Ball Z world, and its role in the story, while often treated as background detail, is worth examining with some attention. The company was founded by Dr. Brief, Bulma's father, and its primary business is the manufacture and distribution of hoi poi capsules, small pill-sized devices that can contain any physical object and release it on command. A capsule might contain a car, a house, a boat, or an airplane. The user simply presses a button, throws the capsule, and the stored object materializes at the point of impact. This technology has profound implications for how the Dragon Ball world operates on a logistical level, and the series makes consistent, quiet use of it as a background convenience. Bulma is established from the very beginning of the Dragon Ball franchise as one of the most gifted scientists and inventors in her world. By the time Dragon Ball Z begins, she has already invented a working scouter device, reverse-engineered from Raditz's equipment, within an implausibly short period of time, a demonstration of an intellectual speed that the story treats as simply part of who she is. Her most consequential invention in Dragon Ball Z is arguably the time machine used by future Trunks, which is classified in official sources as the most advanced piece of technology ever created in the Dragon Ball world. The time machine is not presented as easy to build. Future Trunks mentions that it required enormous resources and many years of work by his version of Bulma. But the fact that a version of Bulma was capable of building it says something specific about the depth of her capabilities. The Capsule Corporation headquarters is a large, distinctive structure located in West City, a domed building surrounded by smaller structures and easily recognizable from the air. It serves as a gathering place for the Z fighters at multiple points in the series, functioning as something between a laboratory and a home base. The gravity chamber that Vegeta uses for training during the Android and Cell sagas is located on the Capsule Corporation grounds and was built using Bulma's engineering knowledge, modified to Vegeta's increasingly demanding specifications. The gravity chamber sequences, Vegeta training alone in high-gravity conditions, pushing the machine further and further beyond its designed parameters, are some of the quietest and most focused character-building moments the series gave to his story. Dr. Brief, Bulma's father, is a character who receives relatively little direct story attention, but who is, by any logical assessment, one of the most significant human beings in the Dragon Ball world. He is the founder and chief engineer of a company that has transformed the logistical infrastructure of daily life for the entire planet. The capsule technology alone, enabling anyone to carry a house in their pocket, to transport vehicles without roads, to store and retrieve any physical object on demand, would represent a civilizational-level technological shift. The story treats this transformation as background, as simply the way the world is, and Dr. Brief himself is a cheerful and somewhat eccentric background character. But the scale of what he built is worth pausing to appreciate. The Dragon Ball Z understanding of the afterlife is developed with considerable specificity, particularly during the Cell and Buu sagas, when multiple major characters spend meaningful narrative time in the dead realm. When a being dies in the Dragon Ball world, their spirit travels to the check-in station, also sometimes referred to as King Yema's office. King Yema is an enormous, broad-shouldered figure who sits at a large desk and evaluates the spiritual record of each soul, determining whether they are sent to heaven, a pleasant, cloud-like realm, or to hell, which in the Japanese original is called the home for infinite losers. The process of this evaluation is presented with a bureaucratic ordinariness that is one of the series' more gently amusing world-building choices. The afterlife as a government office, complete with paperwork. Goku's extended time in the other world, following his death at the beginning of the Cell Saga, is presented as a significant period of training and personal development. He travels the Snake Way, a long winding road that extends from the check-in station toward King Kai's planet, and he does so with a calm deliberateness that is characteristic of his approach to any form of journey. King Kai's planet is small, only about the diameter of a house or two, and its gravity is described as 10 times that of Earth's surface, making simple physical activity significantly more demanding than it would be at home. The combination of the planet's intense gravity and King Kai's patient, methodical teaching style produced Goku's dramatic advancement during the Saiyan Saga, giving him capabilities that no one on Earth had yet imagined. The Otherworld Tournament is an event that occurs during the Cell Saga, and it provides one of Dragon Ball Z's more unusual settings, a martial arts competition among the dead. Participants are fighters from across the universe who have passed away and find themselves with a time and inclination to continue competing in the afterlife. Goku participates and faces opponents who represent fighting traditions from other galaxies and other planets, beings whose techniques are entirely unlike anything he has encountered during his time on Earth, or Namek. These sequences have a light, exploratory quality, as though the story is briefly interested in demonstrating the scope of the universe beyond the handful of worlds the main plot has visited. The Grand Kaio, the highest ranking of the Kaio, who oversees the other four and represents a level of cosmic authority above them, resides on a planet that is the final destination of the Otherworld Tournament arc. This character, referenced in the original Japanese as Dai Kaio, is presented with a combination of cosmic authority and personal idiosyncrasy that is characteristic of how Dragon Ball Z handles beings of great power. He is old, large, and entirely comfortable with his own importance. His planet is significantly larger and more developed than King Kai's small and quiet world. The tournament held there brings together fighters from across the entire other world, And the sequence serves as both character development for Goku and a demonstration of the sheer variety of powerful beings the Dragon Ball universe contains, beyond the narrow field of view the story usually maintains. The Cell games were proposed by Cell as a formal public challenge, announced in a global television broadcast that Cell himself interrupted specifically for this purpose. The challenge was structured in a specific way. Cell would wait for exactly 10 days, giving the world's best fighters time to prepare and travel to the arena he had constructed. The arena was built by Cell himself, on a plateau in a remote area of Earth, and it was designed to be functionally identical to the World Tournament arena. The same dimensions, the same elevated stone platform, the same surrounding space. This choice, a villain building a replica of the sport that the heroes had grown up competing in, carries a particular kind of menace in its calm, methodical precision. The 10-day waiting period before the Cell games is one of the more unusual structural choices in Dragon Ball Z's narrative. Most stories of this type move toward the climactic confrontation as quickly as possible. The Cell Games arc instead inserts a sustained pause, 10 full days of preparation, training, and reflection between Cell's announcement and the actual beginning of combat. During this period, the story moves between multiple characters and locations, checking in on how different people are spending the time that has been given to them. Goku and Gohan emerge from the hyperbolic time chamber. Vegeta trains alone and furiously. Krillin and Yamcha try to prepare in the ways available to human fighters, who are objectively outclassed by what is coming. The world continues. Time passes. The television news coverage of Cell during this period is depicted with a specificity that gives the arc a particular grounded quality. Cell is treated by Earth's media as a public figure, his announcement analyzed and discussed by commentators who do not fully understand what they are observing. The disconnect between the gravity of what Cell represents and the ordinary journalistic machinery being deployed to cover him creates an effect that is both gently absurd and quietly ominous. It is the Dragon Ball world observing itself being covered by institutions that were not designed to cover anything like this, and finding that those institutions simply continue to operate according to their own logic regardless. The Cell games begin with a sequence in which Mr. Satan, a professional fighter and the reigning world martial arts champion, arrives at the arena accompanied by his students and the full apparatus of his public persona, cameras and all. Mr. Satan is one of Dragon Ball Z's most interesting secondary characters precisely because of his ordinariness. He is, by human standards, an exceptionally skilled fighter. By the standards of the Z fighters, he is entirely outclassed. His sincere belief in his own adequacy is both a source of gentle comedy and a surprisingly effective narrative device. He represents the perspective of a world that does not know what it is actually facing. When he is knocked out of the ring by Cell with a single casual gesture, it communicates, in an instant, the scale of the problem in a way that energy readings and power level discussions could not. Dragon Ball GT began airing in Japan on the 7th of February, 1996, approximately 4 months after the Dragon Ball Z manga concluded. Unlike Dragon Ball Z, which had been directly based on Akira Toriyama's manga, Dragon Ball GT was an original anime production, created by the Toei animation team without a corresponding manga source. Toriyama was involved in the series' early development, providing character designs and some conceptual input, but the story and episodes were developed entirely by the anime's writing staff. This distinction gave Dragon Ball GT a different creative character from its predecessor, one that was evident in its tone, its pacing, and the particular choices it made about where to take the story after the end of Dragon Ball Z. The premise of Dragon Ball GT returns to the original Dragon Ball concept of a quest, specifically a quest to recover the Black Star Dragon Balls, a set of more powerful Dragon Balls created by the original Kami and scattered across the galaxy. These Dragon Balls, if left unused for more than a year after a wish is granted, would cause the planet from which they were used to explode. This stakes-raising premise drove the first arc of Dragon Ball GT, sending Goku, Trunks, and a young girl named Pan on an interplanetary journey to recover the scattered balls before Earth was destroyed. The arc has a lighter, more adventurous tone than most of Dragon Ball Z, reflecting the influence of the original Dragon Ball's traveling quest structure. The Baby arc, which forms the middle portion of Dragon Ball GT, introduced a significant and unusually developed villain. Baby is a parasitic organism, the last survivor of a race called the Sufuru, the original inhabitants of planet Vegeta who were conquered and eradicated by the Saiyans long before the events of any Dragon Ball story. Baby's motivation is not simply power or conquest, it is specifically revenge, the systematic destruction of the Saiyan race as payment for what was done to the Sufers. This focused, historically grounded motivation gives Baby a character depth that was noticed and appreciated by many viewers. He is not simply a powerful being seeking more power. He is a creature built entirely from the accumulated grief of an extinct people, and that specificity gives him a particular weight. The Super Saiyan 4 transformation, exclusive to Dragon Ball GT, is among the most visually distinctive forms in the entire franchise. It features black hair, pink-red fur covering the body, a red eye outline, and a darker golden energy than the standard Super Saiyan aura. The form is achieved through a combination of mastering the Great Ape transformation and bringing it under complete conscious control, a different pathway from the purely emotional escalation of the earlier Super Saiyan forms. Toriyama has indicated that the Super Saiyan 4 design was created by his assistant at the time, and that he personally preferred a different aesthetic direction, though the form was included in the series with his approval. Its visual distinctiveness has made it one of the most immediately recognizable designs in the franchise, even among viewers who did not watch Dragon Ball GT extensively. The Dragon Balls are the organizing objects of the entire franchise, 7 spheres of varying sizes, each with a different number of 4-pointed stars on its surface, whose collection summons the eternal dragon Shenron to grant a wish. The rules governing what Shenron can and cannot grant are specific and have evolved across the course of the series. In the original Dragon Ball, the limitations were somewhat loosely defined. By Dragon Ball Z, the rules were considerably more precise. Shenron could not grant a wish that exceeded the power of his creator, meaning that Shenron, created by Kami, could not grant any wish that Kami himself could not have achieved. This creator dependency gave the Dragon Balls an internal logic that connected their capabilities directly to the spiritual development and power of the being who made them. One of the most consistently applied rules of the Dragon Balls throughout Dragon Ball Z is the rule against resurrecting someone who has already been brought back to life once. This limitation drove a significant portion of the story's narrative decisions during the Saiyan and Namek sagas, when the question of who could be brought back and how was of immediate and critical importance. Chiaotzu was killed during the Saiyan Saga, but because he had previously been revived using the Dragon Balls during the original Dragon Ball series, he could not be revived again by the Earth Dragon Balls. The Namekian Dragon Balls did not carry this same restriction, which was part of the reason the mission to planet Namek was undertaken in the first place. After each set of wishes is granted, the Dragon Balls scatter to random locations across the planet and turn to stone, remaining inert for exactly 1 year before reactivating and becoming collectible again. During this dormant year, they are indistinguishable from ordinary rocks, and they emit no energy that can be tracked or detected. This annual dormancy cycle meant that the Dragon Balls could not be a permanent solution to any ongoing problem. There was always a gap, a period of enforced waiting, during which no wish could be made. This structural limitation gave the balls a rhythm of availability and absence that shaped the pacing of stories built around them. The dragon Shenron's physical appearance deserves attention as a distinct and carefully maintained design element. He is an enormous serpentine creature, green in color, with a pair of arms positioned roughly a third of the way down his body, and eyes that glow with a bright red light. He has scales, horns, whiskers, and the general bearing of a being of immense authority. When he appears in the sky, the clouds darken and the sky turns green, an environmental response to his presence that communicates his nature as a being connected to the fundamental energies of the planet. He speaks with authority and directness, granting wishes without ceremony or embellishment, and disappearing immediately after the final wish has been fulfilled. He has no small talk. He has no interest in the particulars of the situation that produced the wish. He is simply the instrument of a profound and particular power, operating according to rules older than any character in the story. The training sequences in Dragon Ball Z are among the most quietly detailed passages in the series, and examining them as a coherent system reveals a sophisticated and internally consistent philosophy of physical and spiritual development. The baseline approach to training for most Dragon Ball Z characters involves prolonged exposure to physical stress, gravity training, repetitive technique practice, and the cultivation of a focused mental state that allows the body to access energy it would not normally be able to reach. This model of training is influenced by various real-world martial arts traditions, simplified and amplified for narrative purposes, but retaining a recognizable core logic. Weighted clothing is used as a training method by several characters in Dragon Ball Z, most notably Piccolo and Goku. The principle is straightforward. Performing the same movements while carrying additional weight builds strength and stamina that is dramatically apparent when the weight is removed. Piccolo wears a weighted turban and shoulder cape that have been calculated in official sources to weigh approximately 250 kilograms, approximately 550 pounds. When he removes this clothing during a serious fight, the resulting increase in his speed and force is immediate and visible. The idea of strength being literally concealed within everyday clothing, that a person might be significantly more capable than they appear at any given moment, is one of the recurring quiet pleasures of watching these characters go about their ordinary lives. Goku's training in the presence of Kaio during the period between his death and the Saiyan invasion represents a specific approach to development that is worth understanding in its particulars. Kaio's training was not primarily focused on increasing raw power output. It was focused on refining technique, expanding the range of what the student could perceive, and introducing specific advanced skills, the Kaioken technique, which multiplies physical capability at the cost of significant bodily strain, and the Spirit Bomb, which channels energy gathered from willing sources across the natural world into a concentrated sphere. These are not simply stronger versions of what Goku already could do. They represent qualitatively different approaches to the use of energy, requiring intellectual and spiritual development as much as physical strength. Vegeta's training philosophy is one of the most interesting in Dragon Ball Z because it is so fundamentally different from Goku's. Goku's development tends to be relational. He grows in the context of battles, teachers, and shared experiences. Vegeta's development is almost entirely solitary and adversarial. He pushes himself through conditions that the story repeatedly implies would be fatal to anyone with a less extreme will to endure. His time in the gravity chamber at Capsule Corporation, training at gravity levels that cause physical damage simply from standing still, is presented not as exceptional dedication but as the normal baseline of his effort. Vegeta is a character who has decided that his own body is primarily an object to be improved, and who pursues that improvement with a focus that never quite becomes peaceful. Gohan's training arc across Dragon Ball Z is perhaps the most emotionally complex because Gohan himself is the most ambivalent of the series' main fighters. He has power, extraordinary, consistent, arguably unprecedented power, but he does not have the same orientation toward combat and training that drives Goku and Vegeta. He is studious, gentle, and more comfortable with books than with battle. His mother Chi-Chi's insistence that he pursue academic education rather than martial training is a recurring source of narrative tension, but it also serves a character function. It grounds Gohan in ordinary human aspiration in a way that none of the other Saiyan characters are grounded. His power, when it emerges, comes not from cultivation but from need, from moments of extremity that bypass the trained pathways and reach for something deeper and less manageable. Frieza is, in many assessments, the most fully realized villain in Dragon Ball Z. His character design is distinctive and specific. A compact, primarily white figure with purple markings who moves with an economy of effort that communicates absolute confidence in his own supremacy. He rarely raises his voice. He never appears uncertain. His cruelty is expressed not through rage, but through a kind of aesthetic preference. He finds destruction beautiful, and he approaches the business of causing it with the unhurried attention of someone who is genuinely enjoying the work. This characterization, which is sustained across dozens of episodes and multiple transformation sequences, gives him a presence that remains memorable long after his story arc has concluded. Frieza's transformations are worth understanding as a deliberate inversion of the typical Dragon Ball Z power structure. Most characters in the series have a normal state and a transformed, more powerful state. Frieza is the opposite. His final most powerful form is the smallest and most aesthetically restrained. His first form is the large mechanically armored figure that arrives on Namek. His second and third forms are progressively larger and more overtly monstrous. His fourth and final form is a smaller, almost delicate figure that is simultaneously the least threatening in appearance and the most dangerous in reality. This design choice communicates something specific about Frieza's relationship to power. He keeps his true capability hidden, maintaining a reserve of strength that he has never needed to use, revealing it only when he chooses to. Cell is a different kind of villain, one whose complexity lies not in personality, but in concept. He is a biological android created using the genetic material of the strongest fighters in the Dragon Ball world, including Goku, Vegeta, Piccolo, Frieza, and King Cold. The idea of a being who carries within his body the potential of all these fighters, who is literally built from the history of every significant battle the series has depicted, gives Cell a unique structural position in the story. He is, in a sense, a distillation of the series itself. Everything it has been made into a single organism that can absorb, adapt, and evolve. His pursuit of perfection through the absorption of androids 17 and 18 is a narrative about the compulsion toward completeness that drives him as surely as Vegeta's pride or Frieza's aesthetic sadism drives them. Majin Buu is the most conceptually unusual of Dragon Ball Z's major villains. He is a magical being of indeterminate origin, created or released by the sorcerer Bibidi, and later controlled by Bibidi's son, Babidi. Buu's nature is fundamentally different from that of the series' previous major antagonists. He is not ambitious, not strategic, not motivated by a legible ideology of power. He is, in his initial pink, round, childlike form, simply a being of instinct and sensation. He likes candy, he likes games, he likes to express himself through destruction without any apparent awareness that destruction is consequential. This combination of infantile innocence and catastrophic capability creates an antagonist who is genuinely disturbing in a way that is entirely unlike the coldly deliberate menace of Frieza or the self-improvement logic of Cell. The evil Buu and Super Buu forms that emerge from Majin Buu's character arc represent a progressive stripping away of even the infantile innocence that defined him initially. The separation of the innocent and evil elements of Buu's personality, a literal physical division in which the thin, gray, angular evil Buu separates from the original Buu, and the subsequent absorption of the innocent form by the evil, creates Super Buu, who retains much of the original Buu's power without any of his playful restraint. The arc then proceeds through a series of further absorptions, Super Buu absorbing Gotenks, then Gohan, that give the story an escalating desperation as the fighters try to respond to a being that simply accumulates whatever power opposes it. The resolution of the Buu arc, involving the removal of the absorbed beings from within Buu's body, has a particular quality of patience about it. The heroes finding a way not to match Buu's power, but to undo its accumulation. The Z-Fighters, the ensemble of Earth's defenders who support Goku, Vegeta, and Gohan through Dragon Ball Z's many conflicts, deserve more careful individual attention than the story always gives them. Krillin is Goku's oldest friend, a former classmate from their shared training under Master Roshi, and the most consistently present human fighter in Dragon Ball Z. He is also, by any honest measure, Significantly outclassed by the alien and artificially enhanced beings the story increasingly focuses on as it progresses. Krillin's power level plateaus well below that of the Saiyans and Namekians, and yet he continues to appear, continues to participate, and continues to matter to the story in ways that are quiet but real. Yamcha is a character whose narrative role contracts significantly across the course of Dragon Ball Z, and his trajectory is worth understanding as a deliberate story choice rather than simply a lack of attention. He was a major character in the original Dragon Ball, a desert bandit turned ally, a skilled fighter with a devoted following and a genuine importance to the early story. Dragon Ball Z gradually moved him into a more peripheral position, and his most prominent moment in the series, his death at the hands of a Cyberman during the Saiyan Saga, became, for many viewers, the signature image of his Dragon Ball Z tenure. This trajectory reflects the story's increasing interest in non-human power levels and the corresponding difficulty of keeping human characters meaningfully engaged in conflicts that have grown far beyond human scale. Piccolo undergoes one of the most complete character transformations in Dragon Ball Z. He begins the series as a recent antagonist, the final villain of the original Dragon Ball, redeemed but still morally ambiguous. By the end of Dragon Ball Z, he is one of the story's most reliable, most principled, and most emotionally grounded characters. The relationship between Piccolo and Gohan, which begins during the year they spend training together before the Saiyan invasion, is the primary engine of this transformation. In Gohan, Piccolo found something he had not expected to find, a student whose development genuinely mattered to him, whose life he became invested in protecting. This unexpected investment changed the shape of who Piccolo was, slowly and without announcement. Tien Shin Han is perhaps the most quietly dignified of the human Z fighters. He is serious, reserved, and intensely committed to his training, pursuing a level of martial discipline that the story portrays with consistent respect, even as it acknowledges that the gap between Tien and the series' Saiyan and Namekian characters has become essentially unclosable. His most notable moment in Dragon Ball Z, using his tri-beam technique repeatedly, and at the cost of his own life force to hold Cell in place during the Android saga, buying time for Androids 16, 17, and 18 to escape, is a moment of pure self-sacrificing effort with no expectation of success. He was not going to defeat Cell. He knew this. He did it anyway. That choice, made with full awareness of its futility, is one of the series' quieter demonstrations of what courage actually looks like when the power difference is insurmountable. Gohan's character arc across Dragon Ball Z is, in many ways, the most complete and sustained character development in the series. He begins as a 4-year-old child at the start of Dragon Ball Z, sensitive, scholarly, and more afraid of the prospect of combat than most of the adults around him. He ends the series as a young adult, married with a daughter of his own, having served as Earth's primary protector during the years of Goku's absence. The distance between these 2 points is enormous, and the journey that connects them is one of the most carefully observed character progressions in the franchise. The central tension of Gohan's character is between his extraordinary inherited power and his genuine disinclination to use it. He is Goku's son, but he is not Goku. Where Goku's defining quality is a pure and uncomplicated love of fighting, Gohan's defining quality is something closer to protectiveness. He fights not because he enjoys it, but because the people he loves are threatened. This means that Gohan's most powerful moments in the series tend to emerge not from sustained training or gradual development, but from sudden explosive anger, the kind that bypasses technique entirely and draws from something below the conscious level. The dynamic between Gohan and Piccolo, developed across years of shared training and mutual reliance, gives Gohan's growth a specific relational grounding. Piccolo was Gohan's first and most formative teacher, and the qualities Piccolo valued, discipline, attentiveness, the ability to endure, shaped the way Gohan approached the challenges the story gave him. The training they undertook in the year before the Saiyan invasion was harsh and practical, and it produced a Gohan who was significantly more capable than anyone had expected. but it also produced a relationship that was affectionate in a specifically restrained way. Two people who did not easily express what they meant to each other, finding ways to communicate it through the wordless language of training and shared effort. Gohan's teenage years in the Great Saiyaman and World Tournament arcs present a version of his character that is sometimes treated as comedic, but is worth taking seriously. He is a teenager trying to balance a secret identity, an academic career, a superhero persona, and the accumulated weight of everything he has been through. The Great Saiyaman costume, with its helmet and flowing cape, is a vehicle for his desire to help people without the complications that come with being immediately recognizable as the person who defeated Cell. The comedy of the costume is real, but beneath it is a young man genuinely trying to find a way to continue being useful in a world that no longer requires him to be the strongest person on the battlefield. Goku is, by any analysis, an unusual kind of hero. He is physically extraordinary, morally sincere, and almost entirely uninterested in the social and political dimensions of the world he inhabits. He does not seek power for its own sake. He does not govern. He does not accumulate. He trains, he fights, he eats, he spends time with his family, and he returns to training. The simplicity of orientation, which might seem like limitation, is presented by the series as something closer to a philosophy, a way of being in the world that is genuinely at peace with its own nature. One of the most consistent facts about Goku across Dragon Ball Z is his appetite. He eats in quantities that the story regularly treats as astronomical, even by the generous standards of a world where characters regularly survive attacks that would level mountains. The official Dragon Ball Z guidebooks describe Goku's daily food consumption in terms that would represent the dietary needs of several ordinary adults combined. This physical reality is connected to his training demands. Maintaining and developing the kind of power he carries requires caloric input that ordinary food consumption could not support. But it is also simply part of who he is, a dimension of his earthly physical nature that the story finds consistently worth including. Goku's relationship with death across Dragon Ball Z is genuinely unusual in the context of heroic narratives. He dies and is revived. He chooses to remain dead for a period of years during the Android and Cell sagas. He treats death not as a terminus, but as a transition, another kind of journey, another place where training is possible and teachers can be found. This equanimity about death is part of what makes Goku a strange and specific kind of hero. He does not carry the anxiety about mortality that drives many of the other characters. He simply continues, in whatever realm he currently inhabits, to be who he is. Goku's naivety, his genuine inability to understand social hierarchy, his lack of interest in whether his behavior is appropriate by the standards of others, his tendency to befriend his enemies and find the best in beings who have done terrible things, is one of the series' most consistent and quietly radical character choices. He is not naive because the story hasn't given him enough experience to know better. He is naive because he has chosen, at a level below deliberation, to encounter the world without the defensive sophistication that experience usually produces. This choice, and it is a choice, whether Goku understands it that way or not, is the source of much of his power and the thing that makes him, in the end, genuinely different from the warriors who oppose him. Dragon Ball Z was produced using traditional cell animation throughout its original run, a process that had been the standard for Japanese animation production since the industry's earliest years. Cell animation involves drawing each frame of movement on transparent acetate sheets. Cells, which are then painted on the reverse side with specific colors, matched to the series' established palette. These painted cells are then photographed against hand-painted background art to create each individual frame of the finished animation. The resulting image has a particular visual quality, slight variations in line weight, occasional imperfections in the paint layer, a visible texture that distinguishes it from the digital animation that would eventually replace it. The line work in Dragon Ball Z's cell animation was done using ink on the acetate cells, traced from the key animation drawings produced by the studio's animators. The precision required to maintain consistent character proportions and line work quality across thousands of cells, produced by teams of animators working in parallel, was considerable. Errors and variations were common and, in the context of weekly broadcast production, were generally accepted unless they were severe enough to significantly affect the visual coherence of the scene. Viewers of older Dragon Ball Z episodes, particularly in the earlier seasons, will sometimes notice frames where a character's proportions are slightly off, or a background element doesn't quite match the continuity of adjacent shots. These moments are not failures of intent. They are simply the material reality of producing animation at scale under time pressure. The color palette established for Dragon Ball Z in its original Japanese production was carefully maintained across the series run by the Toei Animation Color Department. Each character had a specific set of color values assigned to their skin, hair, clothing, and energy effects, and these values were held constant across every episode and every animator who worked on the series. The process of maintaining this consistency, called color design or color script work, required detailed reference documentation that was made available to every team working on the production. Small variations in color, a slightly brighter blue in one episode, a slightly different shade of orange in another, are often the result of variations in how paint mixed or how film was developed, rather than intentional design choices. The introduction of digital production tools in the later seasons of Dragon Ball Z, primarily in the Majin Buu arc, marked a gradual transition that is visible in the visual texture of those episodes. Digital ink and paint, in which the coloring process was moved from physical paint on physical cells to software-based coloring of digitally scanned lean work, produces a slightly different visual character. Cleaner lines, more saturated colors, and a surface quality that is more consistent, but also more smooth than the organic variations of physical cell painting. The transition was not abrupt. It happened gradually, episode by episode, as the studio integrated new tools into its existing workflow. The result is that the aesthetic of Dragon Ball Z changed slightly over the course of its run, in ways that were rarely noticed by casual viewers, but are clearly visible when comparing episodes from different periods. Dragon Ball Z concluded its original Japanese broadcast, run on the 31st of January 1996, with an episode titled Farewell Dragon World. The final episode is quiet, unhurried, and deliberately retrospective. It concludes the Majin Buu arc with the same calm deliberateness that characterized the series at its most thoughtful. The final scene shows a grown-up Goku sparring with a young boy named Oob, a reincarnation of the purified soul of Kid Buu, who represents in the logic of the Dragon Ball world the continuation of a tradition that has been passing from fighter to fighter across the entire length of the story. The image of Goku flying off to train with Oob, already moving toward the next challenge, already engaged with the next student, is a perfectly appropriate ending for a character defined by the forward motion of perpetual engagement. The legacy of Dragon Ball Z in the history of animation is substantial, though it often lives in the memory of a specific generation rather than an academic or critical record. For viewers who encountered the series in the 1990s, whether through its original Japanese broadcast, its North American syndicated run, or its Cartoon Network Toonami airings in the late 90s and early 2000s, Dragon Ball Z was something close to a formative experience. The series aired during after-school hours, when its audience was at a particular age of openness, young enough to be fully absorbed by its world, old enough to begin responding to its more complex, emotional and philosophical dimensions. Dragon Ball Super, which began airing in July of 2015 following a nearly two-decade gap, represented the franchise's return to original television animation, with Toriyama more directly involved in the story's development. The series introduced new concepts: the God Key system, multiple universes with their own divine hierarchies, the Tournament of Power, that expanded the Dragon Ball world considerably beyond the framework that Dragon Ball Z had established. The existence of Dragon Ball Super did not diminish Dragon Ball Z's standing in the memory of those who had grown up with it. If anything, the continued expansion of the franchise seemed to confirm that the world Toriyama had created had depths that decades of exploration had not exhausted. The Danshu guidebooks, first published by Shueisha in Japan between 1995 and 1996, remain among the most detailed official resources for Dragon Ball Z facts available. 7 volumes were published in the original series, covering character data, story summaries, power level charts, world guides, attack dictionaries, anime information, and music. A supplementary volume, the Super Exciting Guide, was later published in connection with Dragon Ball Kai, the remastered and edited version of Dragon Ball Z broadcast beginning in 2009. These guidebooks represent a kind of institutional memory of the series, produced by the people most closely connected to its creation, and they continue to be referenced by researchers and dedicated fans as primary sources for canonical information. Dragon Ball Kai, the remastered version of Dragon Ball Z, removed approximately 140 episodes of filler and pacing-related content from the original 291-episode run, reducing the series to a tighter 167 episodes for its initial broadcast, with additional episodes covering the Buu arc released subsequently. The remastering process updated the audio mix, replaced much of the original music score, and digitally cleaned the original animation frames. The result was a version of Dragon Ball Z that ran closer to the pace of the original manga, moved through its story more directly, and presented the animation in a visual state closer to how it had originally appeared before decades of degradation in the original film and broadcast elements. There is a particular kind of knowledge that asks nothing of you. It does not demand that you react or transform or rise to any challenge. It simply lives quietly in the space between the things you already knew, waiting to be noticed. Dragon Ball Z is full of these quiet facts: the weight of Piccolo's clothing, the number of chapters in the manga, the name of the composer who gave the North American broadcast its particular sound, the rules governing what Shenron can and cannot grant. Taken one at a time, slowly and without urgency, they paint a picture of something that was made by many careful hands over many years, built from decisions both enormous and ordinary, shaped as much by practical necessity as by creative vision. The story was imperfect, as long stories invariably are. It moved slowly when it needed to move slowly, and sometimes when it needed to move quickly. It repeated itself. It made choices that served the moment better than they served the whole. And it also contained, within all of that, moments of genuine and lasting power, moments of grief, of loyalty, of courage applied against impossible odds, of a father finally having enough time and silence to simply be with his son. Those moments did not require perfection from their surroundings to be what they were. So let the details settle around you now like dust in a quiet room. The 219 manga chapters, the 42 volumes with their deep red spines, the gravity chambers, and the Senzu beings, and the stone platform of the World Tournament Arena, all of it resting together in the particular stillness that comes when a story has finished and the night has grown soft. Thanks for spending this time in the Dragon Ball universe with me. If you'd like to keep drifting, another video is ready on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you close your eyes. Sleep might find you before the next story finishes.